So I have the tremendous pleasure this morning. Hi, I'm Katherine. I was late this morning, so I apologize. I have the tremendous pleasure of introducing my long-term, very dear friend, Katherine today. She, as our keynote. Katherine is, among many, many other things, a person very curious about how the world works and a spectacular communicator. And so she has translated those deeply ingrained innate skills into interpretation work. And really, she's here today to talk about many things that I don't yet understand. I'm looking forward to it. I have this little bio written down, so I'm going to look and see if there's anything I don't know. What I don't know is what happened to her. Okay. So let's see. She'll introduce herself. All right, say why you brought me. Oh, why not? Well, I already said why. I think we'll all learn why I brought her. I'm guaranteed it's going to be obvious in about an hour why it is that I brought Katherine. So anyway, she lives in the Eastern Sierra, California. We have known each other since we were teenagers. This is complete nepotism. You're welcome to invite your friends in the future date if you have something interesting to say. And I'm going to pass on the mic.
Yeah, that's the benefit of being board president and all the unpaid unsung hero work, that you get to pick who you want to bring. So I'm benefiting from that. Good morning, everybody. I have to find the right sweet spot here, or I'm not in front of the light. So I'm here today, according to my title, here to talk to you about trying to expand inclusion of midwifery services here in Washington State to include those patients who are culturally and linguistically different than our mainstream Anglo culture. But I'm also going to talk just about communicating and interpreting, and you'll see. I think I'll take us on a fairly broad journey as we go along. But before I really start, I actually want to be sure to remember to say thank you for having me here. Thank you for having a speaker be from outside of your profession. I am a huge believer in the power of professional associations to move a profession forward, because my own profession is young and has experienced the same thing. And I'm also a huge believer in the benefit of bringing people in from outside and attacking shared issues from a perspective you might not have thought about. So I hope that my perspective will be helpful to you, and I will be here all day, and if there's ways I can push the conversation further after the talk, I'm very, very available. So as this is me, I'm going to say who I am here for a minute. That's where I live. That's the view. You can see it, the mountains as I come down the hill every morning to drive my son to school. It's very deserty. It's like being in Eastern Washington. It's like we're on the east side of the Sierras. I live in the middle of nowhere, and I love technology because I get to have this fabulous career living in the middle of nowhere because of technology. So I am an interpreter and translator. I have a master's degree in interpretation and translation. But I'm very much an advocate and pot stirrer in my profession. I co-founded an organization called InterpretAmerica with a conference interpreter. And if you know anything about the world of interpreting, having someone who works in the immigrant end of interpreting services with someone who works in the United Nations end of interpreting services is pot stirring in and of itself in my field. And we do a lot to try and raise awareness about the need for communication and using trained professional interpreters. And I have a feeling that may ring a bell for you as you are trying to gain recognition in your own field and the need for trained, competent midwives. And I also recently have been involved in a fabulous project, which I'm going to touch upon a little bit later, called Indigenous Interpreting Plus, which is working to bridge gaps in a hospital in California who have a large population of indigenous speakers from southern Mexico. And they literally, until they launched this program, had women coming in and giving birth that they could not talk to at all, like nothing. So, because there are many indigenous women from southern Mexico who speak no Spanish. And there's a huge populations coming into California, just as you have large populations of Somali and other less common languages coming into Washington State. So, basically, everything I do supports communication. I love my profession because I get to help people communicate and communicate deeply and profoundly, and it's very enriching. I wanted to take a moment and just, if you would do me the honor or the hassle of raising your hands for me. I wanted to ask you a few questions. So the first question I wanted to ask was, how many people here have studied a second language to the point where they can kind of speak it or fully speak it? Okay, so a lot of us have tried and attempted a second language. How many people here have worked with interpreters in their profession as midwives? Okay, a lot. All right, now that's going to make you have lots of questions. So I'm going to ask some more questions. For those of you who've actually worked with interpreters, are you using on-site? How many are using on-site interpreters? Not very many. How many are using telephonic? Pardon? I got a big mumble from that. Not many on-site because they don't exist? Is that what you were saying? Have anybody used video interpreting? A few. Okay, so we've got like maybe a third that have used interpreters. How many have hired bilingual staff to address your non-English speakers? Very few. Okay.
Can I just
Yes.
Can I just add to this list? We use deaf interpreters in our clinic.
Yes.
They're just another.
And this thing, yes. So not just spoken language, but ASL. I will be largely focusing on spoken language, but really the issues are very, very similar. With the difference that the ASL community of sign language interpreting is about 50 years ahead of spoken language interpreting in the United States. It is a very developed profession. People who go through that profession are incredibly well trained. They have 1,000 hours of training before they ever walk out the door. They get their BA. It's way, way, way ahead of spoken language interpreting. And so when you work with a deaf client, they are much more likely to advocate for themselves and insist on having an interpreter, and you will pay for those services, and they know how to make sure you pay for those services. And that's something that those of us in spoken language interpreting are kind of envious of, to be honest. All right, so thank you for answering those questions. It gives me a little bit of context. So you are MAWS, the Midwives Association of Washington State, and this comes off of one page of your vision statement off your website. So your vision is to establish midwifery at the highest standard of care for all healthy women during childbearing cycle. So again, we're going to talk about how to get the all, be more broadly expanded. So right now you do have, I think, I interviewed a lot of people before I came to this talk because I am from California. I know a lot about interpreting in the state of Washington, and I know less about midwifery, and so I want to be sure that at least I had some knowledge. If I say anything that's incorrect, please correct me. I have no problem with that. But my understanding is that the licensed midwife profession in this state is mostly white, and it's mostly monolingual, and it's not as accessible for people who don't speak English. And that's one of the reasons why I was brought, was to sort of help jumpstart a conversation for how that accessibility could happen. And ironically, or paradoxically, the communities who do not speak English are actually communities who are coming from countries and cultures where midwives are the norm, and they would love to have births that are attended by midwives and not in a hospital room with doctors in a very different, scary clinical setting. So I think you have a great opportunity to bridge that because you have communities that want your service, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to extend those services. Let's see, it's going to come in. One more. Where's my slide? There it is. So that's my goal today. Let's see how we can bridge us together a little bit more. So what I want to talk about today as I go through this talk, and I will leave time for questions and answers. If you have a burning question, please raise your hand. 80 minutes is a long time, so hopefully I'll finish up sometime after an hour and we'll have time to talk. I want to walk us through a bigger frame picture about what it means to be an immigrant in this country and what it means to need language access and how interpreting fits into that piece. I think really we're often very good at thinking about cultural issues, and it's amazing how we forget the language issue is critical to that. It is always amazing to me. And then I want to look through some of the current barriers that at least I was able to educate myself some, with speaking with some of your fellow colleagues, and then provide some potential first steps for how we can move forward and do something concrete. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. So this is, and I'm a big picture person, so you said that's who I am. Hopefully it'll provide a good framework. So these are pictures of our two professions from thousands of years ago. I think arguably we both, respectively, as midwives and as an interpreter, as long as there have been human beings, there have been people helping babies be born, and there have been people helping people who don't speak the same language communicate with each other. They are very, very, very old activities, right? But As professions, modern professions, they're very young. So we share that in common. Licensed midwifery really took root here in Washington State in the 1970s, and I don't have to tell you, I don't think, how unique Washington State is. I come from California. I was very fortunate to have a certified nurse midwife in a hospital help me birth my babies. I did not have the option of licensed midwifery at the time. It didn't exist. I mean, you're way, 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 way ahead. You have so much more infrastructure, which means you get to be the pioneers for your whole field and how you push the field forward and grow your infrastructure. And healthcare interpreting is the same thing. The modern interpreting profession is thought to have been born in the 1950s or 1940s at the Nuremberg trials, when they had the big war crime trials. That's when modern interpreting in conference settings was born, and it took until the 70s and 80s to really trickle out into community areas. And there are many parts of the world where healthcare interpreting is not a thing. It doesn't exist. The US is hands down the leader in healthcare interpreting, and that's because we have MAWS, and then we're going to go through that in a little bit. So basically, we are two professions that are young. We're young little baby professions. We're learning how to sit up. And it's normal that we perhaps haven't connected very well, and it's also normal that you perhaps haven't connected with all the communities you would want to. And on the interpreting side, we also have many gaps in our field. And those gaps are relevant to you because it's going to be hard for you to find the kind of competent, trained interpreters you want to have at your fingertips for all languages, especially some of the languages coming into Washington. But I just view this whole journey as an evolution. And for me, it's super proactive. It's really important that we notice our gaps and complain about our gaps and highlight them, but also just to think, look at all the work we're doing and let's move it another step forward. And 5 years from now, we're going to look back and go, remember when we didn't know anything about interpreters? Remember when we never had any, Somali women in our practices? And that's going to be changed. That's my prediction. We'll look back and it'll be different. So let's look at immigration a little bit, especially in Washington State. Why is this an issue? Healthcare interpreting tipped into a formal profession in the United States because immigration went all over the country for the first time. We've always had immigration, we've always had pockets of people who didn't speak English, who needed some kind of way to bridge healthcare. But in the 90s, it went over the whole country, right? So in Kansas, you have huge populations of Arabic speakers. You've got Russian speakers and Punjabi speakers and Somali speakers and Arabic speakers, right? You've got people all over it, and it tipped to the point where people can no longer ignore it. And in Washington State, these are the official census data, but this came from an updated census in 2013. So foreign-born persons, 13% is probably low. Census data is usually low because they don't capture all the illegal immigrants living in our communities. It's hard for census workers to find them. And language other than English spoken at home, about 20%. The US is a little bit under 20%. So a lot of people, 1/5 of the state of Washington doesn't speak English as a native language. It's a lot of people. So this comes from a 2011 survey for the state of Washington. You have more foreign women than you do foreign men. It's 7.7% of immigrant women in Washington have given birth in the previous year, which is actually higher than the national average. And I think this bottom statistic is the one that interests me. Children of immigrants also account for 35.3% of children in low-income families in Washington. So these populations that don't speak English as a native language are also our poorest populations and the ones most need care. And look at that. I grew up in Oregon. I'm from Eugene. When I was first growing up, until the Cambodian boat people arrived in the 70s, I'm going to date myself, there was not a single person of color anywhere that you could see. And I think that was very true of many places in Washington. Probably not Seattle because it's been such a diverse port city. But now Washington is the third most diverse state in terms of languages in the entire US, right? And if you look at the languages that are spoken here, it may be hard for you to see. This is Spanish, so you have a big percentage. Spanish, that's true all over the country. But you have this big, I think Somali is the third or fourth largest language. So I've heard a lot about the Somali communities moving in. You have the third largest Somali community in the United States in Seattle County. You have a large Vietnamese, large Chinese and Korean. You have a pretty big Hindi and Punjabi. And I will tell you that finding interpreters for Spanish is not going to be your problem. Finding interpreters who are trained in what you need, have the skill set you need in Somali and Punjabi especially, is going to be much harder, right? So and those are things to take into account as we do this work, right? So it's really hard. Our field is young enough. We don't have good easy pathways to competency in our field, and we have even less easy pathways if you don't speak Spanish or one of the more common languages. So these are the communities that are moving into your area. This is what your clientele hopefully will start to look like more. You have some of this in your clientele. All right, so that's immigration, and with immigration comes language access and the need for language access. So I want to define these terms so that people, they're sort of, if you're not part of, it's not part of your world, you don't really know about them. Language access is a term that is US based, and it basically means the laws that say that people who do not speak English have equal access to participate in programs. And there is a big law that governs this, which is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and we'll look at that in a minute. The US is unique in that it does not care about your immigration status. It does not care, all it cares about is that you don't get discriminated against because you can't speak English. So the other term you'll see a lot is limited English proficiency, and that's what you'll see in your clients. Immigrants who live in the dominant culture, the dominant language culture, may have a fair amount of English, but they won't have enough English to navigate our healthcare system, or the culture of our healthcare system, or everything they need to know to have a healthy, safe pregnancy and birth. So limited English proficient, LEP is a jargon in the field. And they do have right to interpreters. So there are language access laws in the United States. They're pretty robust. You have the granddaddy of them all really does come from Title VI, and since 1964, and since 1964, many state laws have been layered over language access, and this is all relevant to you because so here's another question: how many here accept Medicaid? How many people here accept Medicaid? Okay, a lot of you. If you accept Medicaid, this law applies to you. If you accept any kind of federal dollars, even if it's federal dollars that is filtered through state funds, this law applies to you. It means that you are obligated to provide competent, qualified language access service at no cost to your patients. So this is what this law says. No person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, and national origin, be excluded from participation in, or be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or exercise receiving federal financial assistance. It's a huge law. It's unbelievably unenforced, except for when it is enforced. And the state of Washington is one of the few places where it was enforced. There was a complaint brought against the state of Washington several decades ago, complaining of discrimination under Title VI. And the state lost that case, and they have since had to put in a certification process for interpreters in social services and legal and healthcare settings. It's the only state in the nation that has a statewide certification like that. Now, the certification itself is hotly debated as to how good it is and how much competence it measures, but Washington State, as it is unique with midwives, it's unique with interpreting services. So what does it say that you have to do if you're under this law? So basically, you have to take reasonable steps to provide equal access. So that means that if you have 5% of the Punjabi population, you are not expected to hire and pay a Punjabi interpreter full-time because they might only be used 3 times a year, right? That would be unreasonable. Reasonable would be, we have access to a telephonic service when I have a Punjabi patient, right? That one in purple says that agency should advise LEP clients of their rights. That means that you have a right to interpreting service in multilingual pollsters, so they know they can ask for that service. And if they bring their own interpreter, you are still supposed to offer a professional interpreter. We're going to get into that in a little bit too. And here's a little bit more of the guidance. So they should know interpreters available for free. This is the federal guidance. And possible ways that are accepted under the federal government are to use trained bilingual staff, contract interpreters, telephonic interpreters, staff interpreters. It says volunteers, but really that our field has moved well away from using volunteers as interpreters. And you are not allowed to tell patients to say, bring a family member. So in all honesty, and there's no shame at all, how many have actually relied on family members for interpreting service? And really, there is no shame, it's the reality, right? A few of you have. Okay, but that's also something that we're really trying to get away from. So it seems like a no-brainer sometimes. Oh, look, her sister's here, her husband's here, her child is here. But having family members interpret is really problematic. The biggest one is that you're not going to get accurate. You have no idea what their language proficiency is. You have no idea if they even have the vocabulary for all of the anatomy and physiology and baby stuff that you have to do, right? They are emotionally tied to that patient. You have no idea if they're going to interpret everything. You don't know if they're going to accurately interpret it. You don't know if they're going to filter it, or they're going to say, oh, don't worry, Mom, they want this. Or don't worry, dear wife, they want this. You have no control over whether your communication is actually being transmitted. And a trained professional interpreter, your top ethic is complete and accurate transmission of what everyone says, whether you agree with it or not, or like it or not, right? And I want to tell a story about how it can be traumatic in unintended ways for a family member to interpret. I have a friend who is pretty high up in the field in healthcare interpreting in California. She's Italian. She's a trained professional interpreter. She knows better. I mean, she knows that you shouldn't be a family member interpreting, but when her father got sick, and he was going through the hospital system in California, she opted to interpret for him, partly because there aren't any Italian interpreter you're going to find is going to be telephonic. You're not going to have a face-to-face, experience. So she opted to interpret for her father. When the doctor comes in, and what the doctor communicates is that her father has a terminal illness, right? So she suddenly is in this position. First, she has to maintain her impartiality and her objectivity and interpret that. Second, her father had all control over his own healthcare information, just got wiped out. He lost control of being able to absorb the information, to talk with the doctor, and then to communicate it to his daughters as he wanted to. She found out before he did. She had to be the very voice that said, you're going to die, right? And then she couldn't be his advocate in an emotional, biased, one-sided way, the way you want a family member to be in a hospital system. She had to also be interpreting and working for the doctor because she was there. And she talks a lot about how, even as a trained interpreter, it's something she regrets. She said, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I should have been there. I should have been there so I could monitor the interpreting, but I should not have been interpreting. So you think about the situations that you're in as providers, and you sometimes have very joyous outcomes, and you sometimes have very complicated, difficult outcomes. You probably have disclosures around health issues that are unexpected, that you wouldn't want a teenage child to know, or that maybe they don't want their partner to know. You just don't, it's not professional to use family member. So that's that's the slide from my story about that. Don't be a child. Don't use children to interpret. I mean, please, especially do not use children as interpreters. That flips the power balance in an unbelievable way in a family. And in immigrant families, power balance is already flipped to the young kids because they're navigating bilingually in the culture. So if you have a Chinese-speaking mom and she has a 12-year-old boy who's in 6th grade, I guarantee you that boy is interpreting at school, he's interpreting at a doctor's office, he's interpreting at the post office, he's interpreting all the time. There's already a power balance issue in that family. This is something immigrant families go through. So I want to spend a little bit of time also just letting you know what healthcare interpreters do, because I think it's really, really important. If you are going to bring in patients that don't speak English, it's really important that you understand the role the interpreter should have and what it is we actually do, right? So more definitions, just so we know we're all talking about the same thing. An interpreter is somebody who renders an oral message. It's oral, back and forth. It's not written. A translator is something who does a written text. So in our world, if you call me a translator, it's a little bit, I think, like being called maybe a lay midwife as opposed to a licensed midwife. Or if you're a certified nurse midwife, those distinctions matter. They matter to your field, they're real, right? In our field, these distinctions matter. They're different fields. A lot of people do both of them, but you're cross-trained. I'm cross-trained in translation and interpreting. It's not the same skill set. You have a lot of basic skills that are fundamental skills, but it's not the same skill set. And then interpreting is the process of understanding and analyzing a spoken or signed message and then re-expressing it faithfully, accurately, objectively, taking the cultural and social content into account, right? So that's hard. It's hard to do. So these are the kinds of people that typically do healthcare interpreting, bilingual staff, often untrained. I'd say that probably the majority of people who do healthcare interpreting in the United States are bilingual staff who are untrained as interpreters. They often don't even know it's a professional skill set that they should be paying attention to. Contract interpreters or employee interpreters as well, and volunteers. And again, volunteers really want to stay away from. So this is the bane of my profession. Hey, you're bilingual, come translate for me. Hey, you're a receptionist, you speak both languages. Oh, so you grew up here, you're 22, you came here when you were 4, you've been speaking, Spanish is your first language, you've been speaking Spanish in your home since you were, your whole life, and you can speak a mean, social, cultural Spanish. But did you ever read, do you read Spanish? Do you write Spanish? Did you ever study physiology and anatomy in Spanish? So to somebody who's not bilingual, they might look really proficient, when in reality, actually, they have a lot of gaps in their language skills, and they can't interpret what you need them to interpret. But this is the bane of my field. It's like, nobody gets this in this country. So you can do, oh, come on, oh, you speak Arabic? Oh, you can come over here and do this legal issue, right? Like, okay. Totally different systems, totally different terminology, right? So just to give you a sense of what we do, because if you are going to be working with interpreters, especially during a birth, it might last 12 hours, you are asking someone's brain in consecutive. Consecutive is mostly what they would be doing. It would be, she speaks, she pauses, I speak, right? It's like, there's only one person speaking at once. But you're going back and forth, you're code-switching, your brain is going from one language to the other, and then from the other language to the other, and you're analyzing, hearing, and using your short-term memory, and you're doing this over and over and over again, and it gets tiring, right? And simultaneous interpreters, which your interpreters will also need to do to be ethical, because the minute somebody else comes in the room and they're talking to each other, if you really want to give access, you're going to be doing simultaneous interpreter for the patient, or whoever you're being client and doesn't speak English. So simultaneous, you're doing all this all at once. So you're doing all of these things all at once. You have to listen in here and speak. You have to hear the speaker's voice. You have to listen to your own voice. You have to hear the speaker's voice above your voice. And you're monitoring, so you're monitoring your output, you're monitoring their input, you're deciding what they're saying, you're keeping up. It's really, really exhausting. Really exhausting. So this is consecutive, if you think about it, like you hear one voice. Consecutive has a huge load on your short-term memory. Really, really big load on your short-term memory. It's tiring. Interpreting is hard. It's a very special skill set. And if you do simultaneous, this is what you have, right? But really, in our settings, in healthcare settings, this is what you have. You often have multiple people in the room, and lots of people, and lots of sources. So the human brain can only do this for 20 or 30 minutes before it can't do it very well anymore. You need a break. And in conference settings, simultaneous interpreters work in pairs. And they break each other while one's interpreting, the other's monitoring and helping out, but they break, it's a break, and they do it every half hour. And this is at the UN, this is at the highest levels. Doesn't matter, they've done all the studies. You can be a 30-year veteran, and your brain will only go this long before your performance degrades. It's just, your brain is tired, it can't do it, it's a muscle issue. And then the last thing that we have to do if we really want to be good at our job is we have to learn this crazy note-taking system to try and capture information that, when it's done well, looks like that. And then and so there's just a lot of intense message and meaning analysis and thought and intense concentration. So interpreting is, it's possible, but it's hard. And I think it's like midwifery. To me, people probably vastly underestimate how difficult and all of the different things you have to take into account and all the decision points you have when you're providing care, right? So really, if you're a good interpreter, you want to have these different skill sets. You want to have the ability to actually interpret that was sort of gone through, and you also want somebody who's ethical and moral. You do not want an interpreter who's going to speak over the patient. You do not want an untrained Somali or Punjabi or Spanish interpreter who comes in and decides what they're going to share and what they're not going to share, because they know best and they're going to take care of their community member. Yeah. right? You're not going to want someone who you speak for 30 seconds or a minute and they go ba 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 ba, right? And then you speak, or then the patient goes and they go, her stomach hurts, right? Those are all red flags. Something's wrong. They should be speaking for roughly the same amount of time, and it should be completely transparent. They should, whatever someone's saying, you should be hearing. If they're swearing at you, you should be hearing that. If they're swearing at their partner, you should be hearing that. And you should be hearing it exactly as it said. So this is what interpreting looks like. I think you all sort of raised your hand for this. You have face-to-face, which I think is the absolute best standard of care in midwifery situations, and probably be really hard to achieve. You have interpreters with videos, that's video there. This is telephonics, and it's hard to see it, but the woman here has she's got a phone cradled after she's given birth, and there's the interpreter. So they're both hearing the interpreter off two separate handsets. And then this is oops, sorry, do it back here for a second. Go back, I'm not pressing anything. This woman is using portable equipment, and everybody here has headsets on. She's doing it simultaneously. So that's what it looks like. And Washington State, the really awesome news, after we talk about all the ways that it's really, really hard to provide good interpreting care for people who don't speak English, is that Washington State has one of the most advanced infrastructures in the country when it comes to being able to have interpreting paid for. In California, there is no billable, you cannot bill interpreting in a healthcare setting. It's a mandate, you have to do it, it's federal and state law, but nobody, it's like this huge hot potato. I'm not paying for that. I'm not paying for that. And it's expensive, right? If you have to pay an interpreter $25 an hour, which frankly isn't very much money for what they do, it's gonna break your budget if you had to pay for it, right? As providers.
Okay, we are not billing for our interpreter services, and they charge $50 an hour for a 2-hour minimum.
Right.
So that's $100 per prenatal visit.
Right.
So we're making zero.
But you can, if you accept Medicaid,
We do.
you can bill interpreters. So you can bill,
If they're not eligible for Medicaid.
then you can't.
That's
Right. So that's what I'm talking about. These are emerging fields. That's the reality. And so I'm not saying any of this is easy. I'm acknowledging how hard it is. The same is true for private clinicians, small doctors, small clinics. They have this burden of care and they have to provide interpreting, and it's expensive, right? But frankly, for me, I don't know how much a midwife earns per hour, roughly. I know, you're gonna laugh if I count every single last hour, right? And if you can make a living on it, I think it's probably pretty similar. How many people make a full-time living as a midwife in this room? Okay, so most of you are making part-time living off what you're doing. How many people love being midwives? Okay, it's very similar. Interpreters love interpreting. Very few interpreters make a full living. They're always doing something else. That's why most interpreters also translate and do all kinds of other things, right? But it is moving in the right direction. I think it's my next slide. So in the back of the room is this company. This company has the Washington State Healthcare Authority contract to provide competent interpreting services for you and to cover those costs and it might, again, if I'm wrong, they'll correct me, but this is my understanding. It's for the Washington Department of Social Health Services, Medicaid, Medicare, and some other eligible agencies. So it's not just Medicaid. There are more agencies. I really, really encourage everybody to make connections with them, get their cards, sign up with their list, because you have the possibility to at least provide some interpreting services and get paid for it, and not have to do it out of pocket. And that's huge. There are very few states, and I don't know if there's any states yet in the U.S. that has that to the degree that Washington State has. So that's the really good news. Okay. So let's go through. So we've sort of gone through what interpreters do, what language access looks like, who are our communities. So what are our challenges, right? What are challenges? And I wanted to kind of take the Somali community as an example of what are we looking at? What are those communities experiencing? What kind of barriers do you have as midwives to try and bridge these gaps? There are huge cultural disconnects. And I do pick this community, one, because it's growing, two, because it doesn't have this is probably the community that has the most urgent need for people to tend to it in a more proactive, intentional way. People who speak Spanish in the Hispanic community desperately need these services as well. that there is more infrastructure to help them, and we know better how to interact culturally with people from South and Central America than we do, I think, honestly, often people from Africa. Let's see if it's going to come in. There we go. So these are just some of the, Minnesota is another place that has a large Somali community. And if you Google this issue, you can see some pretty interesting papers and reports that are, some research that's starting to be done, like how can we bridge these cultural and language gaps to tend to this community? So there was a study done in 2012 in Minnesota, and I just took some quotes from the study because I thought they were really relevant. So this kind of stuff says about 6 of them I'm going to read. So Western healthcare, you're going to laugh. I usually read off my screen, but I did not bring my glasses and I can't see it. So I took it up the big screen. So Western healthcare can be alienating for many mothers. Somalis have very different expectations for reproductive medicine, right? So Western medicine is preventative, screening, testing, health management, come in every month, come in every 2 weeks, come in every week. Right? And Somalis typically will go to a doctor once a problem emerges, and this is true of many immigrant cultures. They go only when it becomes acute enough to be a problem that needs care, and then they end up in the ER. And they get the most expensive and the worst kind of care, right? So here's a quote from this study. I've had 8 children and everything was fine. I know my baby is healthy because it's moving. Why do I have to be measured every 2 weeks? It's just a basic cultural disconnect. You go and say, come on, you're going to measure every 2 weeks, come on in. And they're like, why do I need to do this? This is like, I have to take off work, I have to take a bus, I have to get here. It's, how come I have to do this, right? Both Somali women and men said C-sections are only acceptable if the mother's or child's life were in danger and objected to the high U.S. rates of C-section. Now, it's my understanding that the Somali community in King County has a very high C-section rate. So if I'm wrong, you can correct me. And I'm sure a lot of that has to do with the fact that doctors are uncomfortable. Providers are uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable too with the community. And so it's like you go to what do I know will get this baby out alive? A C-section, right? It's a lot of work to do the cross-cultural competency. So Somalia's 90% rate of female circumcision is one of the highest in the known world. So we call it genital mutilation in this country, right? We don't call it female circumcision. But it, of course, complicates deliveries. You have to do episiotomies. You have to tell people that they're going to cut. They're going to open this, how much you're going to cut. Huge, intimate cultural issue. And here's one of the providers says, we have no business intervening in a woman's sexual identity. For many Somali women, her circumcision is a beautiful thing that she's proud of, right? I know for me, that's the hard bridge. For me, it's like, what have you done to this woman? But that's not my culture, it's not my experience, it's not my business. I mean, my job would be to work around that and have her have a successful birthing experience in a way that feels empowering to her, right? So my point of that story is that even in sort of liberal, progressive places like Washington and Seattle, King County, and in what we are in professions that are sort of social justice oriented, like midwifery is, I think, and so is interpreting. Difference is we almost automatically and unthinkingly look at difference in a negative way, right? And I want to give one more story of the group of the Oaxacan women in Salinas, in the Salinas Valley, which is an agricultural valley in Central California. They have about 14,000 Oaxacan indigenous speakers who speak, I think they speak up to 20 different variants on dialects. So there are no interpreters, there were no interpreters, and this hospital was flooded with women giving birth with no one to talk to. And one of the things that would happen is that the women would come in, they'd have family members, they'd give birth, and then the mother would pay no attention to the baby, none. And the baby, she would touch it, she would hold it, she would cuddle it. She was not paying, other family members would do it, but the mother wouldn't. So the nurses at this primary care hospital in Salinas were at the point of calling CPS, Child Protective Service. Like, what is wrong with these families? This baby's being neglected. We can't send these babies home, right? Well, when the hospital worked to finally find community members who spoke Spanish and then use their Spanish-English interpreter, what they finally understood was that in their culture, after birth, the mother is protected for 7 days from all labor, all work, all hassle, all stress, so her milk can come in. Because if remote doesn't come in, that baby dies in their communities, right? Because there's no other food source. So her culture was taking care of the mother and the baby. Our culture thought, oh my God, this is horrible. Look at how these people are neglecting their children. And so the only way to solve those problems was for the hospital to be very proactive. So this hospital created what they finally ended up doing. First, they went and they found the community members. And so if you look here, this is a Mixteco woman, and this is a Triqui woman. And they are both now paid interpreters at that hospital. The hospital found funding, they went after grants, they built outreach with the community, they built bridges, and then they created training programs for these interpreters, and then to keep them in the profession, to get them out of the fields. This woman worked in the fields for 20 years in Salinas. And the only way they could get her out of the fields was to give her full-time work. Of course, because she has to support her family. So the hospital created an interpreting services network. They put it up on a telephonic line, so they have jobs from all over the country now, and they have full-time work. And they had a very, very proactive program to address this issue, and it is a thing of beauty. To me, that is a thing of beauty. Those are all indigenous language speakers who come from Oaxaca, who are all working in the fields in California just a few years ago, and they've gone through internship programs, and now they are trained, competent language bridges in the healthcare settings. And it's so to me, this is where really it takes that kind of work. I've never seen anything that doesn't take that kind of work. If you really want to bridge it, you have to do more than just try and find an interpreter through an agency. So that brings us to some of the barriers. We can sum up some of our barriers to care. Language, obviously. The cultural health beliefs are huge, our own as well. Our biases as Western people. Money. Who's going to pay for it? It costs me $100 an hour. That's more than I'm getting. That's like I'm paying for the interpreter, and I'm not getting any money. We don't have the providers you need, and it's really, really uncomfortable, and I'm sure you can all think of many more barriers to care, right? So I'm going to go into the final part of my talk. I always like to leave things on a proactive note of solutions, because it's really easy to identify problems, but it's harder to figure out solutions. So for me, I would say, one, that it's this group here, with your leadership, has a really unique opportunity to do something proactive and to create models that I think would help the whole country. You have good leadership on your board. You have a very developed infrastructure for your profession compared to other states. You're in a state that has a very developed infrastructure around language access and reaching out to communities and culture, and a high value on cultural competency and cultural access to care, right? So this group, you all can be pioneers if this is something that is of value to you and you want to bring your full community in, right? So for me, I would say the first big three things are get more culturally competent as a profession, and you all have to do that. It's very hard to be culturally competent, especially with the current with the actual demographics that you have in front of you. Partner with interpreting and translation agencies and services and educate yourself about what it means to actually provide competent language bridges and to give your patients equal care, not substandard. If you use a volunteer interpreter, a family member, or an untrained interpreter, you are actively providing a second-tier, substandard form of care, just by default. Not intentionally, not with bad intentions. Sometimes it's the only thing that's available, and it's the best you can do, and that's reality. But it is not the same standard of care that we're giving our patients who speak English. And then we build bridges. Washington has a ton of community advocacy organizations who have the ability to build bridges and to actually interact with people. So I want to look at cultural competency first, and I love this picture. I don't know if you can see it. There's Calvin and Hobbes down below the huge giant sky. Talking about cultural competency is like trying to describe the universe, right? It's so complicated and full and long. It takes a whole lifetime to even become a little bit, and so I'm not going to pretend to talk very much about it. But what I would say, in terms of today's topic, was to really think about this definition of what it means to be a culturally competent provider, right? So this means that your system and you yourself can respond in an effective and very respectful way and preserve the dignity of the individuals and families and communities you work with. So that means seeing difference as difference and saying, okay, we're different. Now, in taking the judgment off of it to the greatest degree possible and figuring out this person is going to feel most empowered with this kind of setup. I can't do that, but I can come 60% of the way towards that person. And then maybe I can bring that person closer to me if I take the time to explain my needs, right? There are many models in healthcare that address cultural competency. There are many, many, many resources that are very good that help providers in healthcare settings become more culturally competent. This is one of them. It's called the LEARN model, and it was developed specifically for healthcare providers to know how to interact more in a more culturally competent way. And please note that none of this says memorize the patient's cultural health beliefs. Do you see that? Nowhere in this does it say you need to know the 25 most common Somali cultural health beliefs. That is not cultural competency. Cultural competency is actually being willing to be aware of difference and to talk about difference and to negotiate the difference. It doesn't matter what the difference is. You ask them what the difference is, and they'll tell you what their cultural differences are, and then you go from there, right? And I see some people taking pictures of the slides. I'm happy to share the slides set out with people after the fact. So, if you're interested in a copy. So this was developed by physicians and researchers, and it has really helped in the Midwest, change how some areas are working with their patients, but it really is just one of many. And getting people in who can help provide, you're a small enough group that you could bring someone in for a mini cultural competency thing that really specifically targets midwifery in Washington, and you probably get a long ways even in a couple hours figuring out some strategies. And in terms of cultural competence with interpreters, this is what I would say, because this is typically where interpreters get asked to do things inappropriate to their skill set. Interpreters, because they typically come from the communities that are non-English speaking. I am an anomaly in the field. I am as gringa and white and as native English speaking as you can be. Spanish is my B language, it's very, very much my B language. I am a minority. Everywhere I go in my field, I'm a minority. I work with people who come from other places, and English is not their native language, right? And we are asked to be these cultural experts. What's she thinking? What's going on with her? How come she reacted that way? What's wrong with these people? I mean, it's either positive or negative, right? And we are trying so hard to train interpreters not to overstep their bounds. My job is to help identify. I am allowed under my ethics to say, hey, you know what? I think that there may be a cultural health belief causing problems in the communication here. And then your job as a provider is to say, oh, let's explore that. And you talk with the patient about it. You're not supposed to be talking to the interpreter about that stuff. You should be talking to your patients and your clients, right? So ask them, what's the problem? What caused it? Oh, there was a spell put on me. I have a curse, I have a hex. I got really, really cold at the beginning part of my pregnancy. I hear from Hispanic women a lot, I'm under so much stress, it's going to sour my milk, so I'm not going to breastfeed. That's a very common belief, right? And that directly impacts the health of the baby and the mother, and hopefully you can negotiate around it. You're not going to negotiate around it, just going to say, well, that's stupid, that's superstitious, that's not, no, it doesn't work that way. They're going to say, that midwife doesn't know anything. They might smile at you and like, see them during the session, and then they're going to walk out and ignore everything you said, right? So when we think of it, so the cultural competency is one. The second bubble I had was interpreting and translation. And I put this slide up with this picture because, for me, I think it's a very, very unexplored area of providing interpreting services. And we would want to create some best practices and protocols because it's a very different care setting than interpreters are typically in, right? And how does it differ? So if you think about regular healthcare settings and what we're taught to do as interpreters, we are taught not to develop relationships. It's like we hammer this into healthcare interpreters. Like, you are there to be impartial and unbiased, and you're not supposed to get really friendly with the patient, and don't receive gifts, and don't get all chummy, and don't talk with them about their family. Why? Because you leave an interpreter alone with the patient for 2 seconds, and who speaks the language, and you know what? Don't tell the provider, but my husband beat me last night. Or don't tell the provider, but I didn't take the birth control pills. Or right? And then the interpreter's like, oh God, now what do I do? Right? You have a real ethical dilemma. So we train interpreters not to be touchy-feely. We train them to be warm and professional and distant, right? Well, that's kind of the opposite of what happens with the midwifery relationship. And in order to build trust, it seems like it would be pretty hard for me if you had 10 different interpreters or 20 different interpreters during the course of your 9 months in birth. That's not going to work very well. So I would think that you would want to be working with language lead in the back or whoever your providers are and seeing about finding 2 or 3 interpreters who could be available and be on call or rotate. I mean, there's a lot of issues you kind of would have to work through, I think, to maintain that trust, right? I think it's really doable, and I would guess that there are probably interpreters who would love to interpret for midwifery settings. I would love it. It would be great. But you would have to negotiate that relationship part and that trust part, because the whole point would be you want this woman to, if I'm going to be in the room with this woman for 12 hours while one of the most intimate things in her life happens as she gives birth, she better trust me as the interpreter. I better not do anything that makes her feel unsafe. So you'd have to put some different protocols around it, but I do think it'd be very doable. So some of my recommendations would be to collaborate with professional associations. Healthcare interpreting, actually the very, very first training ever written for healthcare interpreting was written by Cindy Rote of Seattle, Washington. And her training is still taught all around the country 20 years later. You have some of the founders of the field, you have a lot of depth of professionals here and good people to work with. And I'm happy to bridge those contacts if people are interested. And again, I would collaborate with agencies. And I would consider how you could have some training and intern opportunities for interpreters who are interested. I would look at cross-training them so that they are interpreting, but they could also provide services directly, right? I think there's a lot of different things that you could do. I think I just went through some of these. Oh, I guess some just additional things for interpreter ethics that would apply for me. It's like, where do you want me? Where would I be positioned? What do I do when you don't need me? How well can I get to know the family members? Can I talk to them one-on-one, but then should I have to interpret it to everybody? Do I go out of the room? Where am I? If you want to interpret, if you really want to provide competent language access and cultural access, then bring the interpreter into your team from the beginning. Tell them what the issues are. Help them be really good facilitators of communication, right? And finally, I think that the last link in this puzzle is actually developing community outreach and building relationships, and that's the kind of thing that boards of organizations like MAWS can do. It's perfect. That's what boards do. That's what professional leadership should be doing. So I think that the model that is going to work is if you go out and you recruit and you train and you try to retain immigrant members, right? You can be midwives, doulas, office staff, and interpreters. If you train a Somali interpreter or a Punjabi interpreter, that is a precious resource. If they only get 10 hours of work a month, they're going to leave the profession, and then you won't have them. So better to say, hey, let's train you, cross-train. Let's bring you into the profession all the way. Let's give you multiple employment opportunities. You can be a doula and an interpreter. And you learn the ethics of both, and you can apply both. But that's the model that's going to work for you. And you do have a very successful agency here in Seattle that is doing that with doula and midwifery services. Although I'm sure many of you are familiar with prenatal services. But I spent a lot of time speaking with one of their employees, and I was like, yeah, that's the model. And they've proactively gone into the community and recruited people and built bridges and built relationships. And you have to spend the time to do that. You can't just say, well, I'm here, they don't come. I'm here, I'm happy to have them, but they don't come. I'm doing everything I should. If you really want to bring these women in and make your profession safe for them, it's actually on us to do the outreach and to build those bridges and help them learn how to do that kind of outreach in this culture. And then after a while, you hit a tipping point and everybody knows about your service, and there you go, right? And then the other thing about what is working is, I would say, was the model of the organization Indigenous Interpreting Plus, which I've worked with. A lot of really, really effective community outreach. And they've taken time. They've done events for it. They've done press conferences. When they train an interpreter, they hold a press conference and they put it in the newspaper and they give them a graduation ceremony and they make them so proud for being interpreters, right? They make it a really big deal and they help those people in the field. So I'm just about done. I'm going to be done quite really excited for this question. I hope there will be question and answers. I think midwives are essential. I was 20 years ago, well, see, not 20 years ago, but my daughter's 18, and I moved to a very rural place in Eastern California, and I thought I was going to be leaving behind any possibility of midwife assisted birth, and I was so lucky that there was a certified nurse midwife in that tiny little community. And I was able to have that experience, and I had 2 very empowering birth experiences because of it. Even though my daughter was born a month early, and they had literally had the life flight plane ready as protocol dictated. She was almost premature, but it was like, I never knew that. I didn't know that until days after the birth that they even kicked those protocols into place. I just had a great midwife, and it's just essential, right? I mean, I so believe in what you do, and I would love to see what you do be expanded to your whole community, because those people need it. They have the most disempowering birth experiences. It is as bad as it is for people who speak English. Think about how bad it is for people who don't. We all know, you know the horror stories better than I ever will. And you are in a position to help push that forward and change it. And we're indispensable too. I really like this picture of the 2 of the duck talking, and I'm going to interpret for you. I don't know, just tickled my fancy. So interpreters are also indispensable. We're invisible, we're hidden, people don't know about us. But when you get a good interpreter who's trained and professional, you can help facilitate your treatment goals in a way that will make you very, very happy. So I just think the next step would be to take the first step. And if I were perhaps in your shoes, I was trying to think about what could I do if I were an individual midwife, what could I do? Well, I think I would want to know what my local demographics are. I'd want to figure out who's in my community, who am I missing? If I live in the suburbs or practice in the suburbs, I'm missing them. I don't know who they are. Who are their leaders? Who are your leaders? Who are their leaders? Is there a nonprofit advocacy group? Are there people trying to help secure social services? Go meet them, talk to them. I'm a midwife. How can we work together? Right? Who is providing your interpreting services? Who can you make contact with? Washington, these 2 fields are small enough you can get to know the good people, because they're just small fields, right? If you don't feel really culturally competent, like you're not quite sure how to communicate with people of another culture, go ahead and get some training. We know how to do this now. We know how to train people up. Partner with your colleagues. Start a service, start a little outreach piece, try something. Go to one place, offer the services to a few women, right? And work with your professional association who's proactive and really interested in this issue and would support you. Right? So that would be my first steps. I'm sure you have other ones that I'm not thinking of. And otherwise, it's going to go. We might hope we could build a sort of bridge that would magically stand up and actually link both our fields and link our fields to the people who most need our services. So that's my talk. Thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and I think it'll probably kick off. I'm going to put this up. Probably the minute that's going to kick off and after we open the app, it always kicks off. Let me put this down. So I'm going to leave my contact information up. I'm happy to connect with anybody and everybody. But we have about 15 minutes for question and answers, if there are question and answers. Whoops. Should I get this to go out? Here we go.
What do you do with husbands who don't speak English?
What do you do with husbands who don't speak English?
I mean, we have deaf husbands with hearing wives. And maybe the wife is an interpreter, pregnant wife.
So what do you do for the family? So this is, to me, one of the big issues in the kind of care you provide, because you have a primary patient and you have a lot of family members that are involved in the process. And ideally, you would have an interpreter for that husband.
Well, that's what we've done.
Yeah, ideally, if it's a spoken language interpreter, they could possibly do double duty, with the understanding that when the direct communication was happening with the pregnant woman, that's where the priority would go, and they might not understand absolutely everything. But I think those are some of the protocols that I would as an interpreter go, what would be the best practice for that? Like, what would I recommend to her? What is an appropriate way to have that person interact with everybody? And those are some of the questions that I have that I think it would be Valerie's assessment, and I talked about how actually it probably wouldn't be that big a project to try and come up with a best practice white paper or a statement that that would help guide people. So the best way to work. So, any other questions? Go ahead. Right, so you're saying that for you, it's the biggest barrier to doing this is reimbursement. And so you accept Medicare, Medicaid, but you haven't actually looked into what the reimbursement is. So my first answer to everybody who has that same issue is take time with the vendors here who are making this conference possible, who could answer that question for you in your particular case. If you can go back and talk to them and say, this is my clientele, how can I get reimbursed? How much would I get reimbursed? What's the mechanism, right? But I do think it's a real catch-22 because actually if you're taking Medicaid clients, it is your legal responsibility to provide this care, and in the worst case scenario, you could get sued. And people do get sued, and then the fix is usually very expensive. But I would at least try to have some telephonic options. I would look at the different range of options and try to have some ways to bridge that gap that is not using a family member or volunteer, and go from there. But it is the reimbursement, it's the dilemma in the field. You're supposed to do it, but no one pays for it, right? And I don't know what kinds of solutions, to me that's a legislative issue, that's a lobbying issue, that's an issue at the professional level where you're like, you need to get the state to fill that gap in for you so that you can provide the care.
Just a point of clarification, we're talking about how the differences in the midwifery model of care is that our model is not warm, professional, and distant. And
Yeah.
you're saying it's
Right.
the ideal interpretation. And you said a doula possibly training someone in the community that's a doula as well as an interpreter. Are you suggesting that that person actually acts as doula and interpreter at the same time, or is that really too far?
No, I would not. So there are many people who wear those mixed hats. There are a lot, we call them dual role interpreters. They're staff at nonprofit social services hospitals, and they might be a medical assistant, and they might also interpret. They might even be a nurse, and they might also interpret. They may give direct care in that language, and then they would interpret. And so what they need, it is possible to train so that if your doula is, say you trained a Spanish-speaking doula, right? Well, she can provide direct care for the patient. And so when she's providing the doula care, then that's the hat she has on, and she can wear that hat. If she needed to then interpret between the doctors and her patient, she would have to be very clear that in that moment, she was not advocating for the patient, right? So that particular example is difficult.
Yeah.
That's a difficult, it's like in domestic violence, we have a similar example where you can't really be the person who accompanies the victim to court when you're, from the domestic violence agent and interpret at the same time. You can't advocate because then you're biased, right? But there are other roles that you could play. I think that where you could assist or be in office staff or be in other positions where you could serve both as an interpreter, and when you're interpreting, you're interpreting, and then when you're dealing with them with their billing paperwork, you're dealing with them with their billing paperwork, and it's direct care, right? But those are the protocols that would have to be figured out, right?
Thank you.
I'm wondering, I'm the legislative policy chair for MAWS and Val Sasson and I were just talking about speaking with the chief medical officer for Medicaid, Dan Lester, about this issue and seeing if we can get reimbursement from Medicaid. Because generally what happens is what Medicaid does, other payers follow.
Right.
And so if we can get Medicaid to reimburse for interpretive services.
Well, they do. The law is that they follow the patient through outpatient care. So if it's outpatient care, the law is that they do reimburse. That I have to add. What rate and how? Are they here? Do you want to answer the question? Yeah, let's have you answer the question.
Yeah, what was the question?
It was like, how do you reimburse?
I'm talking about Medicaid reimbursement for interpretive services.
So what our company does is we are actually the sole contractor with the state, the healthcare authority, and we provide Medicaid service or interpreter services to Medicaid eligible patients. And we actually do the billing for you. So you would request the interpreter, we know the start time, the end time, and then we bill the state for you. You don't.
And then is the midwife expected to make up the difference in the cost? If Medicaid pays you $50 and the cost is $100, is the midwife expected to do?
They cover the entire appointment.
They do.
As long as the patient is eligible. Oh.
Okay.
I have a problem with interpreters not being available to be on call for the birth. How
How's the birth?
The question was, how do you manage the birth care? On call. So with this contract, all the appointments do have to be pre-scheduled. I know, it's kind of a joke as far as delivery goes. Unfortunately, that's just what this contract dictates. We do offer private pay services, and I believe we can do some sort of on-call interpreting available depending on the language and area that you're at. And we have more information in the back that we can offer on that.
No, and I have, so to answer your question, like, we can go talk to the chief Medicaid officer. So you don't need to talk to them about providing reimbursement. You need to talk to them about dealing with that issue. This is a outpatient care issue that is not schedulable. So how can we adjust the contract to cover that outpatient care? That's what your advocacy would be, I think, don't you? Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you know any foundations that MAWS could potentially pursue who might be interested in helping us set up a model like you were talking about, and building some of the infrastructure and?
Do I know foundations like for grant funding?
Yeah.
I'm familiar with national foundations that could have. There are quite a few federally funded and private funded that do. You would be looking at disparities in care funding. You'd be looking at funding that would try and solve disparities in care based on race and language. And there is a huge disparity, healthcare disparities in care field and funding. There are probably organizations in Washington that I'm not familiar with, but I do know people I could ask and get that answer for you. Yeah. Anything else?
I had a practice in Eastern Washington where there were a lot of immigrants from some where, we had 3 translators before we could get to the woman because the dialect was so unusual. But I offered both hospital and out-of-hospital birth, and I just had an awful time encouraging women to choose out-of-hospital birth because they would say, well, in my culture, if you have the money, you go to the hospital. Right. And once they had a medical coupon, of course they wanted to go to the hospital. And sometimes, even if the woman got it, and it's like, oh my gosh, yes, I'd much rather be out of the hospital, the husband was not having any of that. And I just wonder if other people have had that issue and how they dealt with it.
Well, have other people had that issue? A little bit. I've seen it. It's very common, and I've seen it a lot in the rural Mexican population that I interpret for. It was so ironic when we finally started moving back towards more patient-centered and women-empowered birthing, and the idea that you could have midwife care became more desirable in many ways in the U.S., at least in parts of the U.S. I would be working with my Hispanic clients, and they were receiving the care of a certified nurse midwife, because she was one of only 3 people in 2 counties that were doing delivery, and they would complain about it. She makes me squat. She makes me walk. To them, that felt old-fashioned, because their hospitals were like where our hospitals were in the 60s and 70s. So they had just adopted all the worst care practices as modern. Lie flat on your back, use stretch machines, push out. And to them, that was modern and better, right? And so then they were going back to, no, that's what they do in the countryside. And then so you had this whole kind of class bias and issue. And I would be like, I'd be like, oh my God. To me, it's a matter of, it's patient education, client education, patient education. It's like you actually have to develop the materials and the messaging to address it and work on it. And then if enough women have positive experiences, they're going to go out in the community and say, oh my gosh, this midwife is way wonderful and better, and I'd never have my baby anywhere else but with her, right? Yep. I think we still have a couple more minutes. We have still more time, so any other questions? Everybody ready to stretch and have an early break? Yep. Okay, so if you have any more questions, I'm here all day, and I'm really excited to be here. I think if I had another life, if I had really to have 2 or 3 careers, this would be my next career. And it's just amazing what you do. So I really appreciate what you do, and I hope that if there's any way I can be of service, I will be, and I'm available. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Katherine.
Because we're lucky enough to have Language Link here, I wanted to have Courtney and Jeff come up and just say a little bit more about their services, and then we'll take a quick break.
Morning, everyone. I just want to thank, first of all, Tara for getting in touch with us and allowing us to be a part of this organization and this presentation today. I think it's a pretty good opportunity for us to be here and demonstrate what we have as a company for you guys. I think Amy owes some thanks as well, and Amanda, who's not here, unfortunately. We've been in contact with some really great people, so that's been pretty awesome. I'm Jeffrey Trask, this is Courtney Barrett. We work with CTS Language Link. We're based out of Vancouver, Washington. We are the company that, like Courtney mentioned earlier, we are the sole company for the proprietor of the HCA Healthcare Authority contract. As it relates to you guys, Tara has mentioned that the majority of you are eligible to request services under this contract. How applicable they are, as we're learning more about your organization, that all kind of depend on who you are and where you're at and what service you provide. But we're kind of here to educate you as far as how to sign up for the contract, to let you know that it is free to you. So we do all the billing for you. It's reimbursable through the state, through our company. All we're really here to do for you is get you an interpreter. And as she said it earlier, is mostly for pre-scheduled on-site interpretation appointments. The contract does allow for telephonic as well, but that is a pre-scheduled thing, similar to on-site. So just to get the point across that it's a free service. We do a lot of great things in the state of Washington as far as interpreting is concerned, and we're here to answer all those questions for you as well. Go ahead.
Just one random question, but is it possible when you're requesting an interpreter to make sure that they're female, considering the role of, I mean, lots of people wouldn't want.
Yeah, it definitely is possible. So the way this contract works with our company, it's done in an online system. You will log into what we call an online portal once your account is created. You request everything online, and your interpreter is assigned. You can see when they're assigned. There are specific modifications as far as being able to select a certain gender, even in some scenarios requesting a specific interpreter. All that's governed by the state of Washington. We're just a facilitator of this contract through the state of Washington. So a lot of questions that you'll have that come up contractually, yeah, they may have to be routed to the state government, but as far as how our company facilitates that to you guys, it's done pretty efficiently, and we've been doing it for 2 years now, and it looks like we'll probably be doing it for a lot longer. So, go ahead.
I have a question about how far in advance would it need to be pre-scheduled? Maybe somebody puts an early labor in their time to.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We get that. Yeah, we get that all the time, whether it's an actual medical facility or for midwives. The best way, obviously, if you know out as much ahead of time to schedule it, the better the chances of an interpreter assigning themselves to it. But we always suggest to request it no matter what. Our interpreters' schedules change all the time, so where they may not have been busy a week ago, they may have something open up and can accept a last-minute request. So it all kind of depends on very specific scenarios, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. But always request. That's always our suggestion. So.
My other question is, what happens when somebody engages us and don't respond right away to the telephone call,
So, through the telephone, that is the similar thing to on-site. So you can get a telephonic interpreter. The way it works is when you submit an appointment, all of our interpreters have a very similar online portal that they will see these jobs pop up on, and they can accept themselves to it. We don't actually assign interpreters to specific jobs. They do it themselves. So when you're requesting last minute, it all kind of depends on who's available, if they're checking their online portal. But like I said, always request it because there's a good chance we may be able to assign an interpreter to it, and it'll be covered by the state of Washington. So I think that what's become pretty clear as far as this presentation has been concerned is that we may not be able to cover majority of the appointments you would like, but this does offer some sort of solution for you for some part of that to be covered by the state, and that's kind of the goal for us. So, go ahead.
I'm wondering how far out of the metro area you go. We're practically near Vancouver, BC, not Vancouver, Washington.
So,
is it all over Washington?
Yeah, we have certified interpreters in the entire state of Washington. That's going to be a segue into, well, what about this language? And over in the eastern part of the state where Somali is maybe not as common as it is in Seattle. If you have specific questions to that as you're going through the contract, let us know. We have resources and things that we can do to try get your appointments accepted when maybe you're not having the best of luck as it stands right now. So, but definitely certified interpreters all over the state of Washington. You have to be certified in the state of Washington to work this contract. You guys are going to be receiving medically certified interpreters because of the way that you'll sign up. That's what you'll be receiving. So.
And just to add to that, I know that you had mentioned ethics, and we actually have an interpreter code of ethics. So all of them are mandated, and we actually have a resolution process in case you have an incident or something to that extent. So all of our interpreters are not just certified, but they're also obligated under your code of ethics.
And then also, in our booth in the back, we do have the option for you to sign up for this contract right now, if that's something you would like to do. We're going to be here today till after lunch. I think that'll be a good break to see as many of you as we can, so that we can head back down to Vancouver. But if you want to sign up today, you can. It's very simple. It's easy. The only thing you really need to know that maybe you don't have memorized is your NPI number. But we have that. We can go through the website with you. We can talk about more specifically how it works. And as a supplement to that, even though we were brought here more so on the HCA contract, the Healthcare Authority, we do offer telephonic translation services as a private pay company in the state of Washington. So that may be something that you guys are interested in as well. We can have supplemental information to give that to you, and I think that'd be a great option where maybe the state contract falls short of your needs. So, go ahead.
Do any of the commercial healthcare insurances cover interpretation?
So we are covering patients through Medicaid that are eligible for interpreting services. So depending on the type of insurance that they have, they're under Molina, we get these questions all the time. It really boils down to their state eligibility for interpreting services, which they apply for themselves. As long as they have that coverage, our system checks that, and as long as they're eligible, we can schedule an appointment. You'll know right away whether they're eligible or not on our system.
What if they have Regents or Chimera or?
You'll take them as private pay?
Yeah.
You could
Yeah,
take them as private pay?
Correct. So
But you won't bill their insurance?
No.
So you provide them with a bill that they can submit to their insurance?
Well, we would then bill your clinic, and then you could do whatever, whether that goes to their insurance or not.
good question. But if there's no other questions, and I'm sure if you come back to our booth, you'll have more specific things that you want to talk about. We'll be here, like I said, till after lunch. And again, thank you very much for allowing us to be here. And we can't wait to start working with you guys. So, thank you.